In the vast, windswept steppes of Mongolia, under a sky that stretched endless and blue, a boy named Temujin was born into a world shaped by struggle, loyalty, and survival. The year was sometime around 1162, and the lands that would become his domain were fragmented, a chaotic tapestry of warring clans, shifting alliances, and bitter feuds. But from these harsh beginnings arose a man whose ambition, vision, and unrelenting will would carve out the largest contiguous empire the world had ever known. Temujin's early life was anything but easy. When he was just a child, his father, Yesugei, a minor chieftain and tribal leader, was poisoned by rivals. This death left Temujin's family vulnerable, abandoned by their clan, and forced to endure starvation and exile on the unforgiving steppe. But even in the face of despair, the boy learned early the importance of resilience and strength. Temujin was not content to live as a refugee. He dreamed of uniting the scattered Mongol tribes into a force unlike any seen before. His rise was not just the product of brute force, but a brilliant mix of diplomacy, strategy, and innovation. Temujin understood that loyalty was currency. He rewarded his followers generously and punished betrayal harshly. Unlike the fractious chieftains who ruled by birthright, Temujin promoted leaders by merit, regardless of their tribal origins. His vision was clear: to create a united Mongol nation stronger than the sum of its parts. By his early 30s, Temujin had defeated rival clans, forged alliances, and been proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. This title was more than symbolic. It was a declaration of intent. The Mongol tribes were now a single people, bound by a strict code of laws, the Yasa, which Genghis Khan himself had created. The Yasa governed military discipline, social conduct, and governance. And it was this order that transformed a fractious group of nomads into an unstoppable army. With his united forces, Genghis Khan began his campaign of conquest beyond Mongolia. His military genius lay in his use of speed, surprise, and psychological warfare. His armies were master horsemen, experts in archery, capable of traveling vast distances at a pace that left enemies breathless. They employed feigned retreats, intricate signals, and coordinated multi-pronged attacks. But they also adopted and adapted the best technologies and tactics from conquered peoples: siege engines, gunpowder, and even bureaucratic administration. Genghis Khan's first major external conquest was against the Western Xia, a Chinese kingdom. After subduing the Xia, he turned to the more powerful Jin dynasty of northern China. With a combination of fierce assaults and diplomatic manipulation, Genghis Khan's forces overwhelmed their enemies. By the time of his death, in 1227, vast swathes of Central Asia and northern China were under Mongol control. But the empire did not stop growing. Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons, especially Ogedai Khan, continued expansion, pushing west into the Islamic world, crushing the Khwarezmian Empire and reaching into Eastern Europe. The Mongol Empire would come to stretch from the Pacific Ocean to the Danube River, a vast expanse of diverse peoples, languages, and cultures under a single imperial authority. Despite his reputation as a ruthless conqueror, Genghis Khan also implemented innovations that allowed for governance over such a sprawling empire. The Mongols supported religious freedom, encouraged trade by protecting the Silk Road, and established a messenger system, the Yam, to maintain communication across vast distances. These elements allowed for relative stability and economic growth amid the chaos of conquest. Yet, all empires are mortal. Genghis Khan's death in 1227 marked the beginning of a new era. The empire grew larger, but the unity forged by his personality began to fray. Succession disputes, cultural differences, and the sheer scale of the territories posed challenges that no one man could easily manage. His tomb was kept secret, buried somewhere in Mongolia, lost to history and legend. But his name echoed through time, feared by some, revered by others. The Mongol Empire itself, fragmented over the decades into khanates that eventually weakened and dissolved. Yet the foundations Genghis Khan laid continued to influence global history. Today, Genghis Khan stands as a paradox, a destroyer and a unifier, a brutal warrior and a visionary lawgiver. The largest contiguous empire ever built, born from the dreams of a boy who refused to be broken, shaped the destinies of millions and altered the course of world history forever. The endless sea of grass, known as the Mongolian steppe, spread out beneath a sky so vast and unbroken that it seemed to swallow the horizon whole. This was a land of extremes, bone-chilling winters where the cold sliced through flesh like knives, summers scorched by a merciless sun, and sudden storms that swept the plains with ferocious winds. It was a place both beautiful and brutal, a land where only the strongest survived and the laws of nature ruled supreme. Here, in the mid-12th century, a boy named Temujin was born. His birth was humble, far from the palaces or grand courts of the world's great civilizations. He entered life amid the shifting sands and sparse forests in a nomadic tribe known as the Borjigin. The Borjigin were respected warriors, but they were far from the most powerful clan on the steppe. Their world was a mosaic of rival tribes, each vying for pasture lands, water sources, and dominance. Temujin's early life would be shaped by hardship and survival. His father Yesugei was a chief of the Borjigin, and a warrior famed for his courage and skill. Yesugei had forged alliances through marriages and raids, and his name carried weight across the steppe. But even the mightiest can fall. When Temujin was barely a child, tragedy struck in the cruelest of ways. While returning from a successful raid, Yesugei was poisoned during a feast held by the Tatars, a rival tribe with a long-standing grudge against the Borjigin. The poison was subtle, a slow death that left Yesugei weakened and unable to protect his family. Before long, he succumbed, leaving Temujin and his kin vulnerable. The death of Yesugei shattered the Borjigin family. Without their leader, the clan was abandoned by its allies and shunned by rival tribes eager to claim their lands. Temujin's mother, Holan, found herself thrust into the role of protector and leader. A woman of fierce will and boundless courage, Holan rallied her children and kin to survive in the wilderness that had become their prison. Life became a daily struggle against hunger, the cold, and hostile neighbors. The family wandered the steppes, hunting wild game and gathering what little food they could find. Temujin watched and learned from his mother the art of survival, the value of loyalty, and the necessity of strength. These lessons would become the bedrock of his future rule. From a young age, Temujin displayed qualities that set him apart. He was strong, fast, and fiercely intelligent. He learned to ride horses before he could walk properly, and his skill with the bow and arrow was unmatched among his peers. But more importantly, he possessed a sharp mind for politics and an ability to inspire loyalty. The Mongol world into which Temujin was born was chaotic and violent. The steppe tribes were fiercely independent and often hostile to one another. Tribal leaders rose and fell in constant warfare, and the social structure was deeply hierarchical, dominated by aristocratic families who guarded their privileges jealously. Yet, Temujin dreamed of a different future. He envisioned uniting the fractious tribes into a single nation, one powerful enough to command respect beyond the steppe's borders. His ambition was enormous, and he knew that to achieve it, he would need to overcome betrayal, build alliances, and prove his strength. As a teenager, Temujin's life was marked by both triumph and hardship. He formed alliances through marriage, including his union with Borta, a woman from a powerful tribe. Yet his path was fraught with peril. At one point, he was captured and enslaved by the Merkits, a rival tribe, angered by his rising power. His time in captivity tested his resolve, but he never lost hope. Through courage and help from loyal allies, he escaped and began rallying forces to take revenge and consolidate power. This episode was pivotal. It demonstrated Temujin's resilience and ruthlessness, quality that would both attract followers and strike fear into enemies. He would stop at nothing to unite the Mongol tribes and punish those who opposed him. Temujin's leadership style was revolutionary. Unlike many tribal leaders who relied solely on birthright, he valued loyalty, merit, and discipline. He recruited warriors based on ability, promoted them through the ranks, and demanded strict adherence to rules. His army was no longer a loose collection of clans, but a disciplined and loyal force. He introduced the Yasa, a code of laws that governed everything from military conduct to civil matters. This code emphasized justice, unity, and respect for the ruler, helping to stabilize a previously fractious society. Temujin's military genius was unmatched. He mastered steppe warfare tactics, fast-moving cavalry, feigned retreats, and coordinated attacks. He employed psychological warfare and intelligence gathering, often using spies to sow discord among enemies. Through a combination of military prowess, strategic marriages, and diplomacy, Temujin gradually united the Mongol tribes. In 1206, after a grand assembly known as a Kurultai, the chiefs proclaimed him Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. This was no mere title. It was the birth of an empire. Genghis Khan's rise was a transformation not just of a man, but of a culture. He forged a nation out of chaos, a force that would soon reshape the world. His vision extended beyond conquest. He sought to create a realm where trade, communication, and culture could flourish. This chapter closes with Genghis Khan standing atop the steppe, looking out over the vast lands he now commanded, knowing that his destiny and that of the world was about to change forever. The winds of the Mongolian steppe never ceased. They swept across endless grasses and jagged hills, carrying with them the scent of wildflowers, dust, and the distant thunder of hooves. For the young Temujin, soon to be known as Genghis Khan, these winds whispered both challenge and promise. Each gust was a reminder that in this harsh land, survival demanded more than strength. It required cunning, endurance, and the ability to inspire loyalty among the restless and proud tribes of the steppe. After escaping captivity at the hands of the Merkits, Temujin's journey to power was far from guaranteed. The betrayal had left scars deeper than any wound. His wife Borta had been kidnapped by the Merkits during the raid, a personal blow that ignited a fire of vengeance within him. But Temujin's ambitions were larger than revenge. They were the seeds of empire. In those years following his escape, Temujin faced a series of grueling trials that tested his character and sharpened his skills as a leader. The steppe was no place for weakness. Tribes jostled for land and resources, and alliances were fragile, shifting like the sands beneath their feet. Temujin's challenge was to bind these disparate groups together, to forge unity where there was only division. His approach was as bold as it was strategic. Unlike traditional Mongol leaders who relied on lineage and blood ties, Temujin championed meritocracy. He rewarded loyalty and talent over noble birth, a radical concept that unsettled many aristocrats but attracted ambitious warriors eager for opportunity. Temujin also recognized the power of discipline and organization. He restructured his growing army into decimal units, groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 men, each with appointed leaders who were accountable not only for fighting, but for maintaining order and morale. This system created a military machine of unprecedented efficiency on the steppe. But it was not only military innovation that defined Temujin's rise. His diplomatic skills were equally formidable. He knew when to wield the sword and when to extend the olive branch. Temujin often offered defeated foes the chance to join his growing confederation as allies rather than enemies, promising protection and shared wealth. This pragmatic blend of fear and respect expanded his power far beyond brute force. Temujin's personal charisma was a beacon in the turbulent world of the steppe. Tales of his fairness and ability to settle disputes reached far and wide. He was known to reward honesty and bravery, punishing treachery severely, but also showing mercy when it served his vision. This balance won him followers not just from his own tribe, but from rival clans who saw in him a leader capable of bringing stability. The story of Temujin's hunt for Borta is legendary. When the Merkits kidnapped her, Temujin rallied an army not just to retrieve his wife, but to send a clear message. Betrayal would not be tolerated. The campaign was swift and ruthless. The Merkits were defeated, and Borta returned, but the scars of the conflict lingered, fueling Temujin's resolve to end the era of constant tribal warfare. Throughout these years, Temujin's network of alliances grew. He married strategically, connecting his family with powerful tribes across the steppe, further weaving a web of loyalty and obligation. His sons and brothers were trained in the arts of war and governance, preparing to inherit a legacy of unity and conquest. Yet danger remained ever present. Rivals plotted, jealous nobles conspired, and the vastness of the steppe itself was an unpredictable enemy. Harsh winters, scarce resources, and the threat of rebellion constantly loomed. Temujin's leadership was tested repeatedly, forcing him to adapt and grow. One of his most profound challenges came from the Tatars, the tribe that had poisoned his father. These long-standing enemies controlled fertile lands and commanded large forces. In a decisive campaign, Temujin sought not only to defeat them, but to dismantle their power entirely. The battle was fierce and brutal, demonstrating Temujin's ruthless efficiency and the loyalty he inspired in his warriors. This victory was more than military. It was symbolic. It signaled the rise of a new power on the steppe, one that would not tolerate betrayal or fragmentation. The Tatars' defeat sent shockwaves through neighboring tribes, many of whom began to reconsider their allegiances. As Temujin's influence expanded, so too did his vision. He dreamed not just of ruling the steppe, but of creating an empire that would stretch beyond Mongolia's borders, connecting east and west. To realize this, he needed to unite the Mongol tribes completely. In 1206, after years of campaigning, diplomacy, and consolidation, Temujin called a grand assembly known as a Kurultai, where the chiefs of the Mongol tribes gathered to decide the future. In this historic gathering, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. The title carried the weight of destiny and the promise of unprecedented power. The Kurultai was more than a political event. It was the birth of an empire. Genghis Khan's rise marked a turning point in history, signaling the dawn of an era that would reshape nations, cultures, and civilizations. As the new ruler, Genghis Khan began the monumental task of transforming his confederation of tribes into a unified state. He codified laws, enforced discipline, and prepared his people for the challenges of empire building. His eyes were set on lands far beyond the steppe. Fertile valleys, wealthy cities, and distant kingdoms ripe for conquest. This chapter closes on the cusp of transformation. From a boy born into hardship to a warrior tested by fire, Temujin had become Genghis Khan, the leader of a people ready to change the world. The winds of the steppe continued to blow, carrying with them the promise of empire and the thunder of hooves that would soon echo across continents. The vast Mongolian steppe, with its sweeping grasses and rugged terrain, had long been a place where tribes warred endlessly, each led by chieftains fiercely protective of their own power and traditions. For centuries, the Mongol people lived as scattered bands, nomads tied to their herds, clashing over pasture lands and water, bound by fragile alliances that dissolved with the changing winds. Into this chaotic world stepped a leader unlike any before him, Genghis Khan, born Temujin, whose vision and iron will would forge the tribes into an empire. When Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan in 1206 at the Great Kurultai, he inherited not just a title, but a monumental challenge: how to unite fiercely independent clans whose loyalties were often fleeting and whose leaders jealously guarded their privileges. The old ways, rooted in lineage and tribal custom, seemed ill-suited to the task of building a lasting empire. But Genghis Khan was no ordinary leader. He understood that survival and expansion required transforming the Mongol people from a loose confederation into a disciplined, cohesive force. His first step was to impose order through law, the Yasa Code, a set of rules that extended beyond military discipline into all facets of life. Though the Yasa was never written down, its influence was immense. It forbade theft among Mongols, established harsh penalties for betrayal, and demanded absolute loyalty to the Khan. It also codified religious tolerance and protections for merchants, recognizing that stability depended on more than just military might. One of Genghis Khan's most revolutionary reforms was to break the power of the traditional aristocracy. He replaced clan loyalties with a meritocratic system where warriors rose through the ranks based on ability and loyalty, not birth. He reorganized his forces into units of tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s, each led by commanders personally chosen for their skill and trustworthiness. This system created an unprecedented level of military discipline and efficiency, enabling rapid communication and coordinated attacks across vast distances. The Mongol army under Genghis Khan was a marvel of mobility and strategy. His cavalry was unmatched, capable of covering hundreds of miles quickly, attacking with the precision and speed of a lightning strike. His warriors mastered the composite bow, shooting accurately even at full gallop. They used feigned retreats, ambushes, and psychological warfare to confuse and demoralize enemies. But it was not just brute force that secured victories. Genghis Khan was a master of intelligence gathering and diplomacy, using spies and emissaries to gather information and sow discord among his enemies. Genghis Khan's approach to conquest was pragmatic and often merciful. He preferred to offer defeated tribes the chance to submit peacefully, incorporating them as allies and offering protection and prosperity. This strategy extended the Mongol realm rapidly, bringing new people and resources into the fold without unnecessary bloodshed. His first major military campaigns targeted the Jin dynasty of northern China, a powerful state controlling wealthy cities and fertile lands coveted by the Mongols. These campaigns were tests of adaptability. Genghis Khan's forces learned siege tactics from Chinese engineers, adopting new weapons and strategies to conquer fortified cities. The war was brutal and prolonged, but it demonstrated the Mongol army's growing sophistication and tenacity. While military conquest was crucial, Genghis Khan also recognized the importance of trade and cultural exchange. He secured and protected the Silk Road routes, ensuring safe passage for merchants traveling between East and West. These trade routes not only brought wealth, but facilitated the exchange of ideas, technologies, and religions, enriching the empire's diverse population. Genghis Khan's religious tolerance was another pillar of his rule. Though he followed the traditional Mongol shamanistic beliefs, he respected and protected all religions within his empire: Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and more. This policy helped maintain peace in a vast and culturally varied territory, fostering loyalty and cooperation. Family was central to Genghis Khan's governance. He entrusted his sons with key regions, grooming them as future leaders. His eldest son, Yoshi, and his others, Chagatai, Ogadai, and Tolui, were trained in warfare and administration, ensuring the continuity of his vision. However, uniting the Mongols and expanding the empire came with constant challenges. Harsh winters, vast distances, and the logistics of feeding and moving thousands of warriors tested even Genghis Khan's leadership. Rebellions and rival claims to power forced him to act decisively, often brutally. But his reputation for justice and merit earned him lasting loyalty from his followers. The defeat of the Tatars, longtime enemies who had poisoned his father, was both a personal and political triumph. The crushing victory sent a clear message across the steppe. The era of fractured tribes was over. A new power had risen. By the end of his life, Genghis Khan had transformed the Mongol people. What began as a scattered collection of tribes was now a disciplined empire, capable of challenging the greatest civilizations. His vision had laid the foundation for what would become the largest contiguous empire in history. As this chapter closes, the Mongol horde stands poised on the brink of an era of unprecedented conquest. The world beyond the steppe would soon tremble before the thunder of Mongol hooves, forever changed by the will of a man who rose from exile and hardship to become the universal ruler, Genghis Khan. The Mongolian steppe, a boundless expanse of grass and rock, had long been a land of tribes locked in ceaseless struggle, each seeking supremacy over pastures, water, and honor. Into this turbulent world came a leader unlike any before him, Genghis Khan, born Temujin, whose vision would stretch beyond the endless horizon to forge the largest empire the world had ever seen. His coronation in 1206 at the Great Kurultai was not merely a unification of tribes, but the dawn of a new order, where the once fractious Mongols became a disciplined, relentless force poised to change the course of history. The task before Genghis Khan was immense. To secure his power and realize his grand design, he needed to expand beyond the steppe and conquer the prosperous kingdoms that had long guarded their riches behind walls and armies. The first test of Mongol strength and adaptability would be against the Western Xia Kingdom, an ancient and wealthy realm perched at the edges of the Gobi Desert and the towering mountains of northwest China. Western Xia was a land of fortified cities and cultivated fields, governed by rulers who prided themselves on their strong defenses and flourishing trade. They viewed the Mongols as mere nomads, unworthy of their fear or respect. But Genghis Khan's forces were no ordinary nomadic horde. His army struck with the speed of the winds and the precision of a falcon diving for its prey. From the moment the Mongol cavalry appeared on the horizons, terror rippled through Western Xia. The Mongols deployed their hallmark tactics: swift raids that devastated crops, harried supply lines that starved out cities, and relentless pressure that wore down defenders. They used feigned retreats to lure enemies into ambushes and encirclements that left no escape. Horses laden with arrows darkened the skies, raining death on defenders unprepared for such fury. Yet Western Shia's cities were no easy prey. Their walls stood tall and thick, and their defenders fought with fierce resolve. Here, the Mongols confronted a challenge their traditional nomadic warfare had not prepared them for: protracted sieges against well-fortified urban centers. Genghis Khan, ever the strategist, adapted swiftly. He captured engineers and artisans from the conquered territories, skilled men who built catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams, transforming the Mongol cavalry into a force capable of breaching stone walls. The siege of Western Shia's capital tested the endurance and discipline of Genghis Khan's warriors. Months of battle stretched supplies thin, but the Mongols held firm. Their unity, forged through years of hardship and strict law, gave them strength beyond numbers. Eventually, the city's walls crumbled, and the Western Shia rulers submitted, agreeing to pay tribute and open their lands to Mongol control. The victory was more than military, it was symbolic. It demonstrated that the Mongols were not mere raiders, but an empire in the making, capable of subduing even the most formidable opponents. This success bolstered Genghis Khan's confidence and fueled his ambition. Next in his sights lay the Jin dynasty, which ruled northern China with a powerful and sophisticated government. The Jin were wealthy, their cities bustling centers of culture and commerce, their armies large and well-trained. They believed their walls and armies would keep the nomads at bay. They were wrong. The war with Jin was brutal and drawn out. The Mongols met a level of resistance unlike anything before. City after city resisted with walls, moats, and armies, forcing the Mongols to adapt even further. Siege warfare became an art. The Mongols employed captured engineers to build massive siege engines and learned to coordinate attacks on multiple fronts. They used spies to infiltrate enemy ranks, spreading misinformation and fear. Psychological warfare was central to Mongol strategy. Genghis Khan was ruthless to those who resisted, but merciful to those who surrendered. Cities that opened their gates spared destruction, while those that resisted faced annihilation. This calculated terror eroded enemy morale, leading many cities to capitulate before battle. Beyond the battlefield, Genghis Khan proved himself a visionary ruler. He recognized that to govern such vast and diverse territories required more than conquest. His administration incorporated local leaders who knew their lands and people, maintaining order and loyalty. Trade routes like the Silk Road were secured, bringing unprecedented wealth and cultural exchange between East and West. The Mongol Empire became a melting pot of religions and ideas. Genghis Khan's policy of religious tolerance ensured Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others could practice freely. This tolerance helped maintain peace among diverse populations and fostered intellectual exchange. As the empire expanded, Genghis Khan entrusted his sons and generals with governance, creating a system of regional administration. However, these appointments sowed seeds of future rivalries as ambitions grew. Yet the challenges were immense. The vast distances of the empire, harsh weather, and complex logistics strained resources. Rebellions flared, and enemies plotted revenge. Genghis Khan faced these threats with a combination of military strength and shrewd diplomacy. A personal victory was the destruction of the Tatars, who had poisoned his father. The complete defeat of the Tatars sent a powerful message. Genghis Khan's rule was absolute, and betrayal would be met with total retribution. By the end of this phase of conquest, the Mongol Empire was no longer a patchwork of tribes, but a formidable force that stretched from the Pacific Ocean deep into Central Asia. The world was on the brink of transformation, as the thunder of Mongol hooves would soon echo across the great civilizations of Europe and Asia, rewriting history. The early morning mist hung heavy over the vast Mongolian steppe, where tens of thousands of horsemen stirred in their camps. The distant mountains, veiled in a soft haze, bore silent witness to a transformation sweeping through the heart of Asia. What was once a land ruled by fragmented, warring tribes was now the domain of a single, unyielding force, the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan. His vision extended beyond mere conquest. He sought to build a world order that would span continents, bound by law, loyalty, and unprecedented mobility. Genghis Khan's conquests in the West were only the beginning. The real challenge lay not just in overwhelming enemies with sheer force, but in governing vast territories home to diverse peoples, cultures, and religions. The art of rule, as Genghis understood, was as crucial as the art of war. One of his first priorities after subduing enemies was establishing a communication and logistics system that could keep his sprawling empire connected. The Mongol Empire, stretching thousands of miles across mountains, deserts, and rivers, demanded rapid information flow. Genghis Khan instituted the Yam, an extensive postal relay network of mounted couriers stationed at intervals along the empire's main arteries. Each relay station was a bustling outpost where riders could rest, change horses, and receive fresh orders. This system allowed messages and intelligence to travel at unprecedented speeds, bridging distances that would have taken weeks or months in mere days. The Yam was not only a military necessity, but a symbol of the new order, a vast integrated empire connected by the swift wings of the horse. Alongside the Yam, Genghis Khan introduced a codified legal framework, the Yasa, which governed not only military conduct, but civil affairs as well. Though the exact text was secretive and orally passed among trusted leaders, its influence permeated every corner of Mongol society. The Yasa demanded absolute loyalty to the Khan, prescribed severe penalties for theft and betrayal, and maintained order through strict discipline. Importantly, the Yasa upheld religious freedom and protected merchants and travelers, fostering an environment where trade and ideas could flourish. This legal structure transformed the Mongols from a loose confederation of warriors into a disciplined society capable of governing diverse peoples. Genghis Khan's administrative reforms reflected his meritocratic philosophy. Leadership and governance were assigned based on loyalty, skill, and merit, rather than birthright. This policy extended to the military, where commanders earned their ranks through proven ability. It attracted talented individuals from across the empire, Persians, Chinese, Turks, and others, who brought their expertise to the Mongol cause. The Mongol army itself became a model of organization and efficiency. The decimal system grouped warriors into units of tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s, each led by a commander directly responsible for discipline and order. This structure enabled complex maneuvers and quick mobilization, making the Mongols masters of both swift raids and prolonged campaigns. Their tactics blended speed, surprise, and psychological warfare. They used decoys and feigned retreats to lure enemies into traps, cutting off reinforcements and supply lines. Their ability to adapt quickly to different terrains, from deserts to mountains, made them a nearly unstoppable force. But Genghis Khan's vision extended beyond military conquest. He sought to integrate conquered peoples by respecting their cultures and religions. His empire became a tapestry of faiths: Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, shamanism, and others coexisted under Mongol rule. Religious leaders enjoyed protection and exemption from taxes, a policy that helped prevent rebellion and fostered loyalty. Trade flourished under Mongol protection. The Silk Road, the ancient artery connecting east and west, was revitalized. Caravans laden with silk, spices, precious metals, and exotic goods traveled with newfound security, weaving the economies of distant lands together. This trade not only enriched the empire, but also facilitated cultural and intellectual exchange on an unprecedented scale. Amid these transformations, the Mongols turned their attention to the Khwarezmian Empire, a wealthy realm spanning modern-day Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. Initially, Genghis Khan sought peaceful trade relations with Khwarezm's Shah, sending envoys to establish ties. But the Shah, suspicious and proud, insulted and killed the Mongol emissaries, a grave affront that sealed his fate. In 1219, Genghis Khan launched a massive invasion of Khwarezm, a campaign marked by devastating efficiency and unparalleled brutality. The Mongol armies swept across cities and towns, destroying those that resisted and incorporating those that submitted. The fall of major cities like Bukhara and Samarkand shattered the Shah's power. The siege of Bukhara was a turning point. The city's defenders, confident in their walls, were unprepared for the Mongol siege engines and relentless assaults. When the walls finally fell, the Mongols unleashed fury, but also mercy, sparing artisans, traders, and scholars vital for the empire's prosperity. This calculated brutality served as both punishment and warning. The destruction of Khwarezm opened pathways westward, bringing the Mongols into contact with new cultures and new conflicts. From the deserts of Persia to the Caucasus Mountains, the empire's reach expanded dramatically. Mongol horsemen crossed the Oxus River, entering lands that would soon feel the full force of their power. At the same time, Genghis Khan managed complex family dynamics. His sons, each commanding armies and provinces, were groomed for leadership, but also harbored rival ambitions. Balancing loyalty and rivalry required careful diplomacy and sometimes ruthless decisions. Despite the empire's vastness and diversity, Genghis Khan's leadership remained central. His presence inspired loyalty and fear, his decisions decisive and unyielding. Yet, he was also a ruler who listened to advisors, adapted strategies, and sought to create a legacy that would outlast him. By the end of this chapter, the Mongol Empire was no longer a nomadic horde, but a global force. It had conquered vast lands, built a sophisticated administration, and fostered an unprecedented era of trade and cultural exchange. The thunder of Mongol hooves was heard from the Pacific shores to the edge of Europe, heralding a new age shaped by one man's vision and the indomitable spirit of the steppe. The early morning sun cast a golden light over the boundless Mongolian steppe as thousands of mounted warriors readied themselves for a campaign that would echo through the annals of history. Genghis Khan's empire, forged through years of fierce battles and unyielding discipline, was now poised to reach beyond the familiar lands of Asia, toward the vast and rich civilizations of the Middle East and Europe. The year was 1220, and the world was about to witness the unstoppable rise of the Mongol horde. At the heart of this expansion lay a strategic vision, a calculated, relentless push to unite the known world under the blue sky of Tengri, the eternal sky god whom the Mongols revered. Genghis Khan's armies were no longer just a nomadic raiding force. They had evolved into a sophisticated war machine, capable of coordinating complex campaigns across thousands of miles. His forces were divided into multiple columns, each tasked with specific objectives, moving in unison but striking from different directions, sowing chaos among their enemies. The march westward began with the conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire, a sprawling realm that controlled the critical trade cities along the Silk Road, from the Aral Sea to the Persian Gulf. The Khwarezm Shah was a proud and wealthy ruler, confident in his fortified cities and armies. However, his dismissive treatment of Genghis Khan's envoys ignited the fury of the Mongol leader. What had begun as a diplomatic mission turned into a declaration of war. Genghis Khan mobilized an army estimated at over 100,000 warriors, a colossal force for the time. The campaign through Khwarezm was swift and brutal. The Mongols, masters of mobility and surprise, struck in rapid succession, besieging cities and cutting off supply routes. Their tactics were designed to overwhelm, feigned retreats that lured enemy forces into ambushes, the precise use of archery from horseback, and the strategic use of siege technology captured and adapted from conquered peoples. The city of Bukhara, one of the Khwarezmian Empire's jewels, was a testament to the resilience and wealth of the region. Its towering walls and bustling bazaars spoke of centuries of culture and commerce. Yet even such a mighty city could not withstand the Mongol siege. The Mongols encircled Bukhara, cutting off reinforcements and starving its inhabitants into submission. When the walls finally fell, the aftermath was devastating. Those who resisted faced slaughter, while those who surrendered were often spared and incorporated into the empire's growing mosaic. Samarkand, another key city along the Silk Road, met a similar fate. Known for its beautiful architecture and vibrant intellectual life, Samarkand was a center of art and learning. Yet it too was swept away by the Mongol tide. Despite the destruction, Genghis Khan's policies ensured that scholars, artisans, and merchants were preserved. He recognized that an empire's strength lay not only in military conquest, but in the cultural and economic vitality of its cities. As the Mongols pressed further west, their reach extended into the Caucasus and the fringes of Eastern Europe. The rugged mountain passes of the Caucasus posed a formidable natural barrier, but the Mongol horsemen, skilled in traversing harsh terrains, moved swiftly through. They entered the fertile lands of the Kievan Rus, a collection of principalities that had flourished as centers of Slavic culture and trade. The Mongol invasion of Eastern Europe was unprecedented. Kingdoms that had developed castles, fortifications, and standing armies were caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the Mongol assault. The Battle of the Kalka River in 1223 was a stark demonstration of Mongol military genius. A coalition of Rus princes and their Cuman allies sought to halt the Mongol advance. Despite outnumbering their foes, the coalition fell victim to Mongol tactics. Feigned retreats drew the enemy into traps, while archers on horseback encircled and decimated them. This victory was not merely military, but psychological. The Mongols instilled terror in the hearts of their enemies, a weapon as powerful as any sword or arrow. Rumors of Mongol brutality spread far and wide, causing some cities to surrender without a fight. This strategy saved Mongol resources and accelerated their conquests. Genghis Khan's governance of these vast and diverse lands was equally strategic. He delegated authority to trusted generals and family members, creating a system of regional administration known as ulus. Each ulus was responsible for local governance, but remained loyal to the great Khan. This decentralized yet unified approach allowed the empire to function smoothly despite its enormous size. Trade flourished under Mongol protection. The Silk Road, once threatened by bandits and political instability, was secured by Mongol patrols. Caravans traveled safely, carrying silk, spices, precious metals, and even technological innovations such as papermaking and gunpowder. This trade network facilitated unprecedented cultural and intellectual exchange between East and West, laying foundations for future developments in science, art, and exploration. Religious tolerance was a hallmark of Genghis Khan's reign. Despite his personal shamanist beliefs, he allowed freedom of worship throughout the empire. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and followers of many other faiths found refuge under Mongol rule. Religious leaders were often exempted from taxation, and their institutions protected. This policy helped maintain stability in a multicultural empire. As Genghis Khan aged, he remained deeply involved in the empire's affairs. His leadership was marked by a balance of ruthless pragmatism and visionary foresight. However, the vastness of the empire and the ambitions of his sons and generals sowed seeds of future conflicts. He began preparations to secure a stable succession, understanding that the empire's survival depended on unity after his death. The Mongol Empire at this stage was a force of nature, wild, expansive, and transformative. It had shattered ancient kingdoms, connected distant cultures, and redefined the political and cultural landscape of Eurasia. From the cold steppes of Mongolia to the cities of Persia and the forests of Eastern Europe, the thunder of Mongol hooves was a constant reminder of a new era dawning. The march into the West was not merely a conquest, it was the shaping of a new world, one where the flow of goods, ideas, and peoples would never be the same again. As Genghis Khan looked out over the lands he had united, he knew that the legacy of the Mongol Empire would endure long after the dust of battle had settled. The vast, rolling steppes of Mongolia stretched endlessly beneath the wide sky, the land where Genghis Khan had first risen from a fractured boy to a unifying force that altered the course of history forever. Now, after decades of conquest and empire building, that same land bore silent witness to the twilight of its greatest son. It was 1227. Genghis Khan, the man born as Temujin, was gravely ill. The scars of countless battles marked his body, his shoulders stooped beneath the weight of years and burdens carried. But in his eyes burned the fierce intelligence and indomitable will that had transformed a collection of nomadic tribes into the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen. His final days were spent not in quiet rest, but in urgent counsel with those he trusted most, his sons, generals, and advisors. The future of the empire, he knew, depended on the careful orchestration of succession and governance. For all his strength, he could not live forever, but the empire must endure. In his tent, surrounded by the scent of leather and smoke, Genghis Khan met with his 4 sons, Jochi, the eldest, and a brilliant warrior whose mysterious birth had long been a subject of tension. Chagatai, stern and principled, Ogadai, favored by the Khan and known for his diplomatic skill, and Tolui, the youngest, fierce and loyal. To each he spoke words heavy with expectation and command. "You are the sons of my blood," he said, his voice gravelly but resolute. "The empire I have forged is your inheritance. Guard it well, keep it united, for division is the death of all kingdoms." He knew the delicate balance of power among his sons might tip into rivalry, but he had chosen a successor. Ogadai Khan, his 3rd son, was to be the great Khan. Ogadai had demonstrated not only military prowess, but a wisdom and patience that Genghis believed necessary to govern the sprawling territories now under Mongol control. Yet this decision did not quell the simmering tensions between the brothers. Jochi, whose legitimacy had been questioned due to the circumstances of his birth, chafed under his father's preference. His territories to the west, the vast steppes beyond the Volga, were both a proving ground and a point of pride. Chagatai's stern nature made him less politically inclined, but fiercely loyal to Mongol traditions and law. Tolui, entrusted with the Mongolian heartland and its military forces, was fiercely protective of his family's legacy. Genghis Khan's last order was for absolute secrecy regarding his death. The great Khan's passing was concealed to prevent unrest and potential attacks from enemies who might see weakness in transition. His body was returned to Mongolia, laid to rest in an unmarked grave as per the sacred traditions. Those who buried him swore secrecy, and the very location of his tomb remains a mystery to this day. With Genghis Khan's death, the Mongol Empire faced its greatest test. Could it survive the loss of its founder and continue to grow, or would it fracture into warring factions? Under Ogedai's leadership, the empire did not merely survive, it expanded. Ogedai proved to be an able ruler, combining his father's martial spirit with a pragmatic approach to governance. He continued the campaigns into Eastern Europe, pushing Mongol influence into Hungary, Poland, and beyond. Cities that had never imagined Mongol hordes at their gates now trembled beneath their thunderous approach. But Ogedai's reign was also notable for its administrative reforms. He established a permanent capital at Karakorum, a city that became the political and cultural heart of the empire. Karakorum was a melting pot, where merchants, artisans, and scholars from across Eurasia gathered, reflecting the vastness and diversity of Mongol rule. The Mongol system of governance evolved into a complex hierarchy. Local rulers were often allowed to retain their positions if they pledged loyalty and paid tribute. Governors known as darugachi were appointed to oversee regions, enforce Mongol laws, collect taxes, and maintain order. This blend of central authority and regional autonomy was key to managing the sprawling empire. The Mongols' religious tolerance also played a crucial role in maintaining stability. Ogedai upheld the policy initiated by his father, allowing freedom of worship across the empire. Buddhist monks from Tibet, Muslim imams from Persia, Christian priests from the West, and shamanistic shamans from Mongolia all practiced their faiths without persecution. This pluralism helped to placate conquered peoples and integrate them into the empire. Trade and communication flourished under the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. The empire's vast road network and the Yam postal system ensured swift transmission of messages, goods, and ideas. The Silk Road, once perilous and fragmented, became a bustling highway connecting Europe and Asia. Merchants traveled safely across thousands of miles, carrying silks, spices, metals, and technologies that would influence civilizations for centuries. Yet beneath the outward success, the empire was not without its internal challenges. Rivalries among Genghis Khan's descendants simmered, occasionally flaring into open disputes. The division of the empire into several khanates, including the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China, set the stage for future fragmentation. Ogedai's death in 1241 sparked a crisis. His passing led to a power vacuum, halting the Mongol advance into Europe. The Mongol armies, poised on the edges of the continent, withdrew to elect a new great Khan. This pause saved European kingdoms from total conquest, but it also signaled the beginning of challenges in maintaining the empire's unity. Meanwhile, the descendants of Genghis Khan continued to expand their influence in their respective regions. In Persia, the Ilkhans embraced Islam and adapted Mongol governance to local traditions. The Golden Horde established dominance over Russia, influencing its development for centuries. The Yuan dynasty in China, established by Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, would become one of the most powerful empires in Chinese history. The legacy of Genghis Khan was thus a double-edged sword, a vast empire connected by roads and laws, but also a sprawling entity difficult to govern from a single center. The ideals of unity and discipline would be tested repeatedly by the ambitions of rival princes and the complexities of diverse cultures. Despite these trials, the impact of the Mongol Empire was profound and lasting. The exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies facilitated by Mongol rule helped usher in a new era of globalization, long before the term existed. Innovations such as printing, gunpowder, and medical knowledge traveled along the Silk Road to reshape societies far beyond Mongolia. In the end, Genghis Khan's vision of a united world under the eternal blue sky was realized not just through conquest, but through the connections he forged among distant peoples. His death marked the end of an era, but his legacy would echo through the centuries. An empire built on the thunder of hooves, the wisdom of law, and the courage to dream beyond the horizon. The steppe winds whispered tales of conquest, weaving through the mountains and rivers that defined the vast expanse of Asia. But now, as the 13th century deepened, those winds carried the weight of change, the transformation of a nomadic empire into a dynasty rooted in the ancient civilizations of China. At the heart of this transformation stood Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, whose vision extended far beyond the battlefield. Born in 1215 into a world shaped by his grandfather's relentless campaigns, Kublai was no ordinary Mongol prince. From a young age, he displayed a keen intellect, an appetite for learning, and a diplomatic skill that set him apart. His early years were spent studying Chinese language, culture, and governance, knowledge that would prove crucial as he prepared to rule one of the most sophisticated and populous regions on Earth. The Mongol conquest of China was far from a simple military campaign. The Jin dynasty in northern China had already fallen, crushed by the unstoppable Mongol war machine. Yet the Song dynasty in the south resisted fiercely, wielding advanced technology, fortified cities, and a powerful navy. For decades, Mongol armies engaged in grueling battles, sieges, and blockades, testing the endurance of both sides. Kublai, rising as a military leader and statesman, recognized that China required a different approach than the brutal raids and open battles that had characterized the Mongol conquests elsewhere. He envisioned an empire where Mongol and Chinese traditions could coexist, where administration and culture would blend to create stability. In 1260, following the death of his older brother, Mongol Khan, Kublai seized the throne of the Mongol Empire, though not without contest. A civil war erupted between Kublai and his younger brother, Arik Boka, fracturing Mongol unity. Ultimately, Kublai emerged victorious, securing his position as Great Khan and focusing his energies on the conquest of the Song and the establishment of his new dynasty. The capital city of Karakorum, once the center of Mongol power on the steppes, gave way to a new imperial seat, Khanbalik, meaning City of the Khan, known today as Beijing. This city was transformed into a thriving metropolis, blending Mongol nomadic culture with Chinese urban sophistication. Palaces, temples, markets, and administrative buildings rose from the earth, symbolizing the Mongol ambition to rule as legitimate emperors of China. Kublai's administration was a careful balance of Mongol authority and Chinese bureaucracy. He retained Mongol nobles in key military and political roles, but employed Chinese Confucian scholars and officials to manage civil affairs. This hybrid government allowed the empire to function efficiently while respecting the local customs that had governed China for centuries. One of Kublai's grand projects was the completion and expansion of the Grand Canal, an ancient waterway that connected the fertile southern provinces with the northern capital. This feat of engineering not only facilitated the transport of grain and goods, but also symbolized the unity of the empire's diverse regions. It enabled armies to move swiftly and markets to flourish. Trade thrived under Kublai's rule. The Mongol Empire, through its vast networks, ensured the safety of merchants and caravans traversing the Silk Road. Goods from as far as the Mediterranean, India, and Southeast Asia flowed into China's markets, while Chinese porcelain, silk, and tea made their way westward. The empire became a hub of exchange, where ideas and innovations transcended borders. Culturally, Kublai Khan fostered a cosmopolitan court that welcomed scholars, artists, and religious leaders from many backgrounds. Buddhist monasteries were built alongside Taoist temples and Islamic mosques. The arts flourished, blending Mongol, Chinese, Persian, and European influences in unique ways. However, ruling such a vast and diverse empire was not without difficulties. Traditional Mongol elites often resented Kublai's adoption of Chinese customs and administrative methods. Many felt that the empire was losing its warrior spirit and nomadic identity. This tension simmered beneath the surface, occasionally erupting into conflict. The military campaigns against the southern Song continued for decades, marked by fierce battles and sieges. The Song employed advanced technologies including gunpowder weapons, while the Mongols adapted with their own innovations. In 1279, after decades of struggle, the Yuan forces finally defeated the Song, uniting all of China under Mongol rule for the first time in history. Kublai Khan's reign thus marked a turning point. The Mongol Empire was no longer merely a vast collection of conquered lands, but had transformed into a ruling dynasty that shaped the course of Chinese history. Yet the legacy was complex. While the Yuan dynasty brought stability and prosperity, it also faced challenges of cultural integration, economic strain, and internal dissent. As the dust settled on the sprawling battlefields of the Song conquest, Kublai Khan found himself ruler not only of Mongolia's wild steppes, but of one of the most populous and sophisticated civilizations on Earth. The weight of this responsibility was immense. Governing China meant more than military might. It demanded political savvy, cultural diplomacy, and economic stewardship. Kublai understood that to maintain control, he would need to embrace and adapt Chinese systems rather than attempt to simply impose Mongol traditions. This pragmatic approach extended beyond governance to daily life and court culture. He adopted the trappings of a Chinese emperor: elaborate rituals, Confucian ceremonies, and patronage of the arts. Yet beneath this veneer lay a Mongol heart, keenly aware of the balance between preservation and transformation. The Yuan dynasty instituted a new social hierarchy designed to maintain Mongol dominance while managing the vast Chinese population. At the top were the Mongols themselves, followed by various Simu groups, Central Asians, Persians, and other non-Han peoples, then the Han Chinese of northern China, and finally the southern Song Chinese. This stratification bred resentment, especially among the Chinese, who saw their centuries-old culture subordinated to foreign rulers. Despite this, Kublai sought to encourage economic growth and cultural flourishing. He invested heavily in infrastructure, expanding roads, canals, and postal routes to improve communication and trade. The Grand Canal's extension was a marvel of engineering, linking the fertile Yangtze River basin with the northern capital, allowing the steady flow of grain to feed the growing urban population and armies. Under Mongol protection, the Silk Road flourished as never before. Merchants from Venice to Samarkand, from Baghdad to Hangzhou, traveled this highway of empires, bringing goods and stories, inventions and religions. It was in this era that Marco Polo's famous journey took place. a Venetian trader who marveled at the wealth, sophistication, and cosmopolitanism of Kublai Khan's court. The Yuan capital, Khanbalik, became a vibrant melting pot. Markets buzzed with traders speaking dozens of languages. Exotic spices mingled with the aroma of roasted meats. Scholars debated philosophy, while artisans crafted exquisite ceramics and textiles blending Mongol boldness with Chinese finesse. Religious tolerance continued to be a hallmark. Kublai patronized Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, and Christianity alike, seeing faiths as a source of harmony and stability. Monasteries and temples were centers of learning, medicine, and culture, attracting followers from across Asia. Yet the complexities of ruling such a diverse empire were daunting. Mongol elites often viewed their increasing assimilation to Chinese customs as a loss of their martial identity. This cultural tension led to court intrigues and power struggles, which at times weakened central authority. Administratively, the Yuan dynasty introduced innovations, such as paper currency backed by the government, which facilitated commerce but also led to inflation and economic difficulties. Heavy taxation and forced labor for large projects bred unrest, especially in the southern provinces. Peasant revolts began to simmer, driven by famine, corruption, and cultural alienation. The Mongol military, while formidable, was stretched thin, trying to maintain control over vast and sometimes hostile territories. Resistance pockets remained, especially in southern China, where the legacy of the Song dynasty still inspired loyalty. Kublai Khan, aware of these threats, spent his later years trying to strengthen the administration and quell dissent. He sent envoys across the empire to inspect governance and root out corruption. Despite these efforts, cracks in the Yuan dynasty's foundation were becoming increasingly apparent. The Mongol dynasty's rule over China would last less than a century, but its impact was profound. It introduced new governance models, fostered unprecedented cultural exchanges, and reshaped China's relationship with the wider world. Kublai's reign also left an indelible legacy on the Mongol people themselves, marking a transformation from nomadic conquerors to settled rulers of a vast and diverse empire. This transformation would influence subsequent generations, shaping the political and cultural landscape of Asia for centuries. As Kublai Khan's life drew to a close in 1294, the empire he built faced both promise and peril. His successors struggled to maintain the balance he had forged, battling internal divisions and external pressures that would eventually lead to the dynasty's decline. The death of Genghis Khan marked the birth of an empire unlike any before, one stitched together from the blood, iron, and ambition of a people born of the steppe. Yet, as time passed and the sun set on the golden age of Mongol unity, that vast dominion began to fracture into competing realms, each ruled by a son or grandson of the great Khan. The empire that once thundered across continents was now a patchwork of khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. Each of these inheritors of Mongol power faced the monumental task of ruling lands far-flung and culturally distinct, while wrestling with internal pressures and external threats. Far to the northwest, the Golden Horde carved its rule across the expansive Russian plains and beyond. Established by Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis, the Golden Horde was a force unlike any Russia had known. At first, the Mongols brought devastation. Cities like Kiev and Vladimir were razed, their populations decimated. Yet, the Mongol rule evolved beyond sheer destruction. The Horde established a tributary system, demanding taxes and loyalty from the patchwork of Russian principalities. The Russian princes, forced into uneasy submission, became intermediaries between the Mongol rulers and their own people. This system ensured Mongol dominance without direct administration, allowing local rulers to maintain a degree of autonomy. Under the Horde's influence, Russian politics and society underwent profound changes. Military tactics, administrative methods, and even the idea of centralized rule drew inspiration from Mongol practices. The Horde's demands shaped Russian diplomacy, as princes learned to negotiate with their powerful overlords. Moscow, a relatively minor principality at first, grew in power by skillfully navigating these relationships, sowing the seeds for the future Russian state. But the Horde was not without its own struggles. The vastness of the land, the diversity of its peoples, and internal power struggles among Mongol aristocrats complicated governance. Rival factions within the Horde vied for control, often through violent means. The constant threat of rebellion from subject peoples and pressure from neighboring powers, like the rising Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, stretched the Horde's resources. Natural disasters, economic shifts, and outbreaks of plague further weakened the Horde's grip. By the late 14th century, the once mighty Golden Horde began to fracture, its lands contested by emerging regional powers and internal warlords. Yet its legacy endured, shaping the political and cultural landscape of Eastern Europe for centuries. Southwest of the steppes, the Ilkhanate rose in the rich historic lands of Persia. Founded by Hulagu Khan, another grandson of Genghis, the Ilkhanate was a synthesis of Mongol conquest and Persian civilization. The Mongol invaders initially brought destruction to Baghdad and other cities, ending the Abbasid Caliphate's centuries-old rule. However, the Ilkhanate rulers soon sought to legitimize their authority by embracing Islam, the religion of their new subjects. This conversion marked a turning point. The Ilkhanate became a patron of Persian arts, culture, and scholarship. Under rulers like Genghis Khan and Olgitu, the Ilkhanate fostered architectural marvels, vibrant literary works, and scientific advancement. Persian bureaucrats and scholars played key roles in administration, merging Mongol authority with local traditions. Yet the Ilkhanate's history was turbulent. Succession crises, factional struggles, and conflicts with neighboring states such as the Mamluks in Egypt drained resources. The region suffered from famines, plagues, and economic fluctuations, challenging the ruler's ability to maintain control. Despite these hardships, the Ilkhanate's cultural and political achievements influenced the region's development, bridging the gap between Mongol conquerors and Persian civilization, and leaving a legacy that resonated long after the Khanate's decline. In the deserts and mountains of Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate held sway over a landscape of nomadic tribes, caravan cities, and trade routes vital to the Silk Road's vitality. Named after Chagatai Khan, Genghis's second son, this Khanate was a melting pot of Mongol and Turkic peoples, with Islamic culture gaining increasing influence. The Chagatai rulers faced the difficult task of balancing the traditional nomadic lifestyle with the demands of governing sedentary populations. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara thrived as centers of commerce, culture, and learning, attracting merchants and scholars from across the Islamic world. Religious transformation shaped the Khanate's identity. While initially following Mongol shamanistic practices, many Chagatai rulers converted to Islam, strengthening ties with their Muslim subjects. This shift led to tensions within the Mongol aristocracy, as different factions aligned with traditional Mongol or Islamic values. The Khanate was not immune to internal conflict, rivalries among ruling factions, struggles for succession, and the pressures of maintaining control over a fractious populace created instability. Yet the Chagatai Khanate remained a vital player in Central Asian politics and trade, for centuries, influencing the region's culture and history. Meanwhile, the Yuan dynasty, Kublai Khan's legacy in China, faced mounting difficulties. While initially stable under Kublai's rule, the dynasty struggled to maintain legitimacy among the Han Chinese majority. Social stratification, heavy taxation, and corruption bred resentment. Natural disasters, including floods and famines, worsened the situation. Peasant revolts began to rise, fueled by economic hardship and nationalist sentiment. The dynasty's reliance on foreign administrators alienated many locals, and factionalism at court further destabilized governance. The Red Turban Rebellion erupted in the 1350s, signaling widespread dissatisfaction. By 1368, the Yuan were expelled from China proper, retreating to Mongolia and marking the end of Mongol rule over the heartland of the empire. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire did not mark the end of Mongol influence. Each Khanate left enduring legacies. The Golden Horde shaped Eastern Europe's future. The Ilkhanate fostered Persian cultural renaissance. The Chagatai Khanate kept Central Asia vibrant and connected, and the Yuan dynasty influenced Chinese governance and culture. However, the disunity also hastened the empire's decline as a centralized power. Competing ambitions, ethnic tensions, economic difficulties, and external pressures eroded the cohesion Genghis Khan had once forged. Yet the Mongol Empire's vast road networks, policies of religious tolerance, and facilitation of trade continued to impact Eurasian history profoundly. The Silk Road thrived under their protection, and ideas, technologies, and cultures flowed across continents as never before. This chapter of fragmentation is a testament to the difficulties of maintaining an empire born of conquest over diverse peoples and geographies. It reveals the challenges of succession, the complexities of governance, and the enduring human dramas of power, identity, and survival. As the once mighty Mongol Empire fractured into rival khanates, the world they had shaped found itself on the cusp of profound change. The unified force that had toppled empires, redrawn maps, and connected East and West was now splintered into autonomous realms, each struggling to maintain authority in a turbulent age. The death of Kublai Khan marked not an end, but a beginning of political and cultural upheaval, one that would redefine the legacy of the Mongols and the future of Eurasia. Among the many powers vying to fill the vacuum was the Principality of Moscow, a seemingly modest state on the northeastern edge of Europe. Under Mongol suzerainty, Moscow was a tributary, obligated to send wealth to the Golden Horde. Yet its rulers harbored greater ambitions. The Grand Princes of Moscow, especially Ivan I, the money bag, began to skillfully consolidate power by collecting taxes for the Horde and suppressing rival Russian princes. This role elevated Moscow's prestige and resources, enabling it to expand militarily and politically. Moscow's rise was no accident, but the result of strategic diplomacy, military acumen, and opportunism. The Mongol rulers, though fierce conquerors, preferred to govern through indirect control and alliances, allowing Moscow to flourish as an intermediary. The city became a hub of administration, culture, and commerce, slowly but surely transforming from a vassal to a sovereign power. As Moscow grew, the Golden Horde's grip weakened. Internal divisions among the Mongol aristocracy fostered power struggles, draining resources and destabilizing governance. Rival factions fought for supremacy, while external enemies pressed at their borders. The rise of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the expansion of Polish influence, and internal rebellions further chipped away at the Horde's authority. By the late 14th century, Moscow had begun to assert greater independence, culminating in the legendary Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, where the forces of the Russian prince Dmitry Donskoy defeated a Mongol army. Though the Golden Horde would linger for decades more, this battle symbolized the beginning of the end for Mongol dominance in Eastern Europe. Southward and eastward, the Ilkhanate in Persia faced its own tempestuous fate. While Hulagu Khan's initial conquests had devastated Baghdad and ended the Abbasid Caliphate, the Mongol rulers soon embraced Islam, integrating deeply with Persian society. This conversion was not merely spiritual but political, fostering legitimacy among their Muslim subjects. Under rulers like Genghis Khan and Uljetu, the Ilkhanate presided over a cultural renaissance. Persian art, architecture, poetry, and science flourished, blending Mongol and Persian influences into a unique synthesis. The Ilkhanate's capital cities, such as Tabriz and Maragha, became centers of learning and culture, attracting scholars from across the Islamic world. Yet the Ilkhanate was riddled with internal strife. Succession crises and factional rivalries weakened the central authority. Conflicts with the neighboring Mamluks drained military resources. Economic difficulties, caused in part by the disruption of trade routes and famines, bred discontent. The fragmentation of the Ilkhanate in the mid-14th century further splintered the region into smaller states, but its cultural and political achievements continued to influence Persia's future, laying groundwork for the Timurid and Safavid dynasties. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate faced equally formidable challenges. Governing a vast region of deserts, mountains, and trade cities, the Khanate was a mosaic of nomadic Mongols, Turkic tribes, and Islamic urban populations. The rulers struggled to reconcile their Mongol heritage with the growing influence of Islam, which was embraced by many of their subjects. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara thrived as nodes on the Silk Road, their markets teeming with goods, ideas, and peoples from across Asia and Europe. The Khanate became a crucible of cultural exchange, but was also a hotbed of political rivalry. Religious tensions occasionally erupted, and competing factions vied for control. The Chagatai Khanate fractured into eastern and western halves. By the late 14th century, with Timur Tamerlane rising from the western part to carve his own empire that sought to revive the Mongol legacy through conquest and patronage of the arts. Meanwhile, the Yuan dynasty in China, Kublai Khan's grand experiment in blending Mongol and Chinese rule, was faltering. Though Kublai had successfully conquered the Song dynasty and united China, his successors struggled to maintain the delicate balance of power and legitimacy. The Yuan administration was marked by heavy taxation, rampant corruption, and social stratification that favored Mongols and foreign administrators over the Han Chinese majority. Natural disasters like floods, famines, and epidemics exacerbated public suffering, while court intrigues sapped government effectiveness. Peasant uprisings, including the Red Turban Rebellion, spread across the land in the 1350s, fueled by economic hardship and nationalist fervor. By 1368, the rebel leader Zhu Yuanzhang had declared the founding of the Ming dynasty, forcing the Yuan rulers to retreat northward to Mongolia. This retreat marked the end of Mongol rule in China proper, but not the end of Mongol influence. The Yuan rulers continued to claim the title of Great Khans, and their presence in Mongolia and Central Asia remained significant for decades. The Mongol Empire's fragmentation thus reshaped the political landscape of Eurasia. While no longer unified under a single banner, the Khanates continued to play crucial roles in trade, cultural exchange, and diplomacy. The Silk Road thrived under their protection, linking the far reaches of Asia with Europe and enabling unprecedented movement of goods, technologies, and ideas. Despite their decline, the Mongols left a lasting imprint. Their military innovations influenced armies for centuries. Their policies of religious tolerance created multi-faith empires. Their administrative reforms, like census-taking and postal systems, informed future governance. Yet the empire's divisions also reflected the fragility of conquest without sustainable unity. The struggles for succession, cultural integration, and economic stability exposed the limits of Mongol power. As new empires rose from the ashes, the Ming in China, the Timurid in Central Asia, the Russian Tsardom in the north, the Mongol legacy remained a powerful undercurrent, shaping the course of history across continents. The dust of the Mongol Empire's fragmentation had barely settled when a new figure emerged from the heart of Central Asia. Destined to revive the nomadic warrior spirit that had once conquered continents. Timur, known to history as Tamerlane, was no ordinary warlord. He was a man of contradictions, a ruthless conqueror and a cultured patron, a barbarian with a taste for art, and a leader whose ambitions rivaled those of Genghis Khan himself. Born around 1336 in the region near present-day Shahrisabz in modern Uzbekistan, Timur hailed from the Balas tribe, a Turkicized Mongol clan with roots tracing back to the great Mongol armies. Though he was handicapped by a lame leg, a physical deformity that earned him the nickname Tamerlane, from Timur-Ilang, meaning Timur the Lame, his spirit and intellect were formidable. From a young age, Timur was immersed in the fractured world of post-Mongol Central Asia. The once great Chagatai Khanate, ruled by descendants of Genghis Khan's second son, had splintered into warring factions. Rival tribal leaders, competing for control of the lucrative Silk Road cities, fought incessantly. Timur's early years were marked by this turbulence, a landscape where power was won through strength, alliances, and cunning. Despite lacking direct descent from Genghis Khan himself, a lineage critical for legitimate rule among Mongol and Turkic tribes, Timur skillfully maneuvered within the political landscape. He married into Genghisid families to bolster his claim, though ultimately his power rested on his military prowess and charismatic leadership. Timur's army was a fearsome force, blending Mongol cavalry tactics with emerging innovations. His forces struck with lightning speed, overwhelming foes with mobility, archery, and psychological warfare. Timur was notorious for his brutal campaigns. Cities that resisted faced annihilation, and entire populations could be slaughtered or enslaved. His ruthlessness was legendary, yet he balanced terror with the projection of himself as a just ruler and protector of Islam. One of Timur's first significant victories was the defeat of rival tribes and the consolidation of Transoxiana, the fertile region between the Amudarya and Syardarya rivers. With this base secured, Timur set his sights on broader ambitions. Persia, fragmented and weakened by the collapse of the Ilkhanate, became a prime target. Timur swept through Persian lands, toppling local rulers and claiming vast territories. His campaigns did not stop there. Timur invaded the Caucasus, pushing into Georgia and Armenia. He launched invasions into northern India, sacking Delhi with overwhelming force. To the west, his armies devastated parts of Mesopotamia and Syria, famously besieging the city of Aleppo. Timur's forces even marched toward the gates of Moscow, intimidating the Russian principalities still recovering from the legacy of Mongol domination. Despite his conquests, Timur was more than just a destroyer. He saw himself as a restorer of the Mongol Empire's glory and a champion of Islam. He commissioned monumental architectural projects in his capital Samarkand, transforming it into a city of glittering madrasas, mosques, and palaces. Scholars, poets, and artists were welcomed at his court, blending Persian, Turkic, and Mongol cultural traditions. Timur's patronage fostered a renaissance of art and learning. The intricate tilework of his buildings, the flourishing of Persian literature, and the revival of Silk Road commerce marked his reign as a period of remarkable cultural vitality. Yet his empire was also marked by volatility. His death in 1405 during a campaign against the Ming dynasty left a power vacuum. His descendants struggled to maintain control, and eventually the Timurid Empire fragmented into smaller states, paving the way for the rise of new powers, including the Uzbek Khanates and later the Mughal Empire, founded by Babur, Timur's descendant. Timur's legacy is complex. To some, he was a bloodthirsty conqueror who left destruction in his wake. To others, a visionary ruler who revitalized a fractured region and fostered an extraordinary cultural flowering. His life embodies the paradox of empire, creation through destruction, power balanced with patronage, and a relentless drive to leave a mark on history. The story of Timur is a vivid chapter in the saga of the Mongol world, a testament to how the spirit of Genghis Khan endured through new leaders who adapted, transformed, and shaped the course of Eurasian history long after the original empire had splintered. The year 1405 dawned cold and uncertain in the city of Otrar, on the wind-swept edge of the steppes. There, under heavy blankets, and among a circle of trusted generals and physicians, the great conqueror, Timur, breathed his last. He had been marching eastward in one final audacious campaign, intent on bringing the Ming dynasty of China to its knees, just as he had with Delhi, Baghdad, and Damascus. But death halted his march. The steel soul of Central Asia, the man who had reshaped the world through fire and stone, was gone. Timur's death left a vacuum in an empire built entirely on his personal charisma, strategic brilliance, and the fear he inspired. Like the empires of his Mongol forebears, the Timurid state was not designed for peaceful succession. There were no clear protocols, no imperial councils to vote on a replacement, no surviving sons capable of commanding unquestioned loyalty from the fractious nobility. What Timur left behind was a fragile, loosely held mosaic of territories stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Indus River, from the steppes of Kazakhstan to the Persian Gulf, and everyone wanted a piece of it. Timur had multiple sons, but by the time of his death, only one remained alive. Shah Rukh, calm, scholarly, and devout, Shah Rukh lacked the military edge of his father, but possessed an astute political mind. He quickly moved to consolidate power in the empire's eastern regions, particularly in Khorasan and Herat. The western portions, including Persia, Mesopotamia, and the Caucasus, fell into chaos as rival generals and ambitious Timurid princes clashed. Shah Rukh, recognizing that brute force would not suffice to hold the empire together, shifted strategies. He sought legitimacy through diplomacy, religious patronage, and culture. He ruled from Herat, transforming the city into the intellectual and artistic capital of the Islamic world. Poets, architects, mathematicians, and theologians flocked to his court, where Persian and Turkic traditions mingled with the scientific legacy of the Mongols and Arabs. One of Shah Rukh's most important acts was to support his son, Ulugh Beg, as governor of Transoxiana, the lands around Samarkand. Ulugh Beg, more a scholar than a soldier, was a rarity among Timurids, a prince who preferred celestial observations to battlefield maneuver. Under his guidance, the Samarkand Observatory rose, a marvel of medieval science. There, Ulugh Beg and his team catalogued thousands of stars with unprecedented precision. His Zigi Sultani star catalogue would remain influential for centuries, demonstrating how Mongol Timurid rule, once known for conquest, could also foster knowledge and and wonder. But while the intellectual flame burned bright in Samarkand and Herat, the political situation worsened. Shah Rukh spent much of his reign putting out fires, literally and figuratively, as rebellious princes, tribal warlords, and foreign enemies tested the limits of his power. He succeeded in maintaining a fragile unity for several decades, but upon his death in 1447, the entire Timurid realm began to unravel. Now came a familiar tune, the song of civil war. Timur's descendants, lacking a dominant central figure, fought bitterly for dominance. Cities changed hands with dizzying frequency. Brothers poisoned one another, cousins clashed on desert fields, and local governors declared independence. Into this maelstrom stepped a cunning new power from the north, the Uzbeks. The Uzbek tribes, descendants of the same steppe warriors who had once ridden under Genghis Khan, were now united under the ambitious Abul Khair and later Muhammad Shaybani. Seeing the Timurids mired in fratricide, they seized the opportunity to invade Transoxiana. In 1500, Shaybani defeated the Timurid Sultan Ali Mirza at the Battle of Sar-e-Pul and swiftly took Samarkand and Bukhara. The cities once lit by Ulugh Beg's stars now bowed to new rulers, the Shaybanids, who would forge a powerful Uzbek Khanate from the ashes of Timur's empire. But even as the Timurids fell in Central Asia, their legacy refused to die. Far to the south, in the rugged highlands of Fergana, lived a Timurid prince named Babur. A descendant of Timur on his father's side and Genghis Khan through his mother, Babur watched helplessly as the Shaybanids expelled him from his ancestral lands. But rather than fade into obscurity, Babur turned his eyes eastward to India, a land both rich and fragmented, its sultanates weakened by internal strife. Babur crossed the Khyber Pass in 1526 with a modest force but a revolutionary weapon, field artillery. At the First Battle of Panipat, his cannons shattered the war elephants and massed troops of the Delhi Sultanate, ushering in a new era. Babur founded the Mughal Empire, a dynasty that would blend Timurid sophistication with Indian grandeur, giving rise to rulers like Akbar, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb. Thus, even as the Timurids fell in Central Asia, they rose again in India, proof that the Mongol spirit, though diluted and transformed, was still very much alive. Meanwhile, in the western reaches of Eurasia, another legacy unfolded. The Ottoman Empire, rising from the ruins of the Seljuks and the Byzantines, had taken notice of Timur's earlier sack of Anatolia and the Levant. Though the Ottomans had been temporarily humbled by Timur's crushing victory at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, they had recovered quickly. Over the next century, they would expand relentlessly, taking Constantinople in 1453 and becoming the preeminent power in the Islamic world. The Ottomans, though not direct descendants of the Mongols, borrowed heavily from Mongol administrative models, military structures, and cosmopolitan governance. Their sultans, like Suleiman the Magnificent, ruled over vast multi-ethnic empires, echoing the diversity once commanded by Genghis Khan and Timur. In Persia, too, the echoes of Timur's empire lingered. The Safavid dynasty, which emerged in the early 16th century, drew on both Timurid and Mongol traditions. Though Shia Islam would become their unifying ideology, their military organization and territorial ambition were deeply influenced by their Turco-Mongol forebears. Back in Central Asia, under Shaybanid and later Janid rule, cities like Samarkand and Bukhara remained vital centers of learning and commerce. Though no longer imperial capitals, they kept the flame of Persian Turkic Islamic culture alive. The poetry of Jami, the philosophy of Avicenna, and the legends of Timur continued to be taught and celebrated. What then did the Timurids truly leave behind? They left ruins, yes, of cities razed, of blood spilled in the name of glory. But they also left vaulting arches of turquoise and gold, observatories pointed at stars, and empires that would continue to define entire regions. They demonstrated that empire was not merely about territory or taxes, but about vision, a dream of connecting worlds, of creating order from chaos, of balancing the sword and the scroll. And perhaps most of all, they proved that the Mongol legacy, far from ending with the death of Genghis Khan or the fall of the Yuan dynasty, was like a river that found new paths to flow, sometimes turbulent, sometimes serene, but always moving forward, shaping the world in its wake. As chapter 12 closes, Timur's bones rest in his jade tomb in Samarkand, under the glittering dome of Gur-e Amir. The inscription said to be carved upon his grave warns, "Whosoever disturbs my tomb will unleash an invader more terrible than I." And though centuries passed, the world would never quite forget the thunder that once rolled out of Central Asia. In the wake of the great Mongol conquests and the eventual disintegration of their empire into khanates and successor states, what remained was more than the ashes of war and the ruins of cities. What endured was a legacy, a deep structural imprint left upon the world they had conquered. For though the thunder of hooves had quieted and the empire no longer flew under the banner of the Great Khan, the influence of Mongol rule permeated Eurasia like the invisible wind over the steppes. Even as new dynasties and states emerged from the rubble of Mongol authority, Ottomans, Safavids, Mughals, and Russian Tsars among them, they carried forward many of the institutional and ideological innovations the Mongols had introduced. The Mongol legacy wasn't just carved in stone monuments or written in the blood of battlefields. It lived on in laws, in infrastructure, in the very way empires were imagined and governed. And at the heart of this legacy was the Yasa, the great code of laws attributed to Genghis Khan. The Yasa was not a written constitution in the modern sense, but rather a fluid, oral body of decrees, military, civil, and social, that governed the lives of the Mongol elite and their subjects. From military discipline and religious tolerance to inheritance rights and diplomatic protocol, the Yasa formed the moral and legal backbone of Mongol governance. It was an evolving, adaptable system that gave shape to a multi-ethnic, multicultural empire. One of its most remarkable features was its emphasis on religious tolerance. Unlike many medieval rulers who enforced their faith by the sword, Genghis Khan declared that all religions were to be respected because he believed that the divine was mysterious and that no one faith could claim monopoly over truth. In practice, this meant that Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, and even animists found protection under Mongol rule. Clergy of all faiths were often exempted from taxes and military service, and temples, mosques, and churches were rebuilt under the auspices of the Khans. This tolerance wasn't born from altruism, but from pragmatism. The Mongols understood that to govern the vast diversity of Eurasia, suppression would breed rebellion. Unity would come not through forced homogeneity, but through structured plurality. Communication, in a land without smartphones or radio, was the artery of imperial control. And here too, the Mongols innovated. The Yam system, a kind of medieval postal and relay network, stretched thousands of miles from Karakoram to Kiev, from Samarkand to Beijing. Riders would change horses at relay stations positioned every 25 to 40 kilometers, allowing messages to travel across the empire at record speed. Imperial messengers carried a paisa, a bronze medallion that gave them priority access to horses, food, and lodging, akin to diplomatic immunity today. This infrastructure enabled not just military coordination, but also commerce. The Silk Road, once fragmented and dangerous, was now patrolled and regulated under the so-called Pax Mongolica. Merchants could travel from Italy to China with relative safety. Paper money, passports, and trade documents were standardized. Goods flowed across the steppes: silk, spices, porcelain, and gems, while ideas, art, and technology moved alongside them. Gunpowder, printing, compass navigation, and astronomical knowledge passed from east to west through Mongol channels. The Islamic world's advancements in algebra, medicine, and architecture mingled with Chinese innovations and European curiosity, creating the conditions for what some historians call the first phase of globalization. In this exchange, even death played a role. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century, is believed to have spread via Mongol trade routes. The siege of the Genoese outpost of Kaffa in Crimea by Mongol forces allegedly saw plague-infected bodies catapulted over the walls, a terrifying act of early biological warfare. From there, the disease traveled on merchant ships to Italy, then across the continent, killing millions. But while the Mongols unintentionally facilitated pandemics, they just as significantly facilitated Renaissance. Many European thinkers, Marco Polo among them, wrote about Mongol governance with fascination. Papal envoys visited the Khans. Artisans and scholars brought back stories of cities more cosmopolitan and tolerant than their own. The very idea that vast, diverse peoples could be governed under a single administrative and cultural umbrella was a radical concept, one that would echo centuries later in the age of empire. And then there was Russia. Nowhere did the Mongol impact run deeper than in the lands of the Rus. The Golden Horde's long dominion over the Russian principalities through tribute, intimidation, and indirect rule altered the trajectory of Russian governance. While the Mongols never settled these lands en masse, their presence changed everything. The centralization of authority, the militarization of society, and the use of tax farming were all direct inheritances from Mongol systems. The Grand Duchy of Moscow, which rose from humble tributary status to dominate its rivals, owed its ascent to clever manipulation of Mongol structures. Russian princes collected taxes on behalf of the horde, gaining wealth and prestige. Over time, these methods were internalized. By the time Ivan III declared Moscow's independence from Mongol rule, he had already inherited the tools of empire, tools he would later use to build the Russian Tsardom. Even the concept of absolute monarchy, the Tsar as the god-anointed autocrat, finds echoes in the Mongol Khan's divine mandate. The very architecture of the Kremlin, the use of census for control, and the creation of a standing military force mirrored Mongol innovations. Meanwhile, in China, the legacy was more ambiguous. The Yuan dynasty had collapsed in 1368, replaced by the fiercely native Ming. Mongols were driven back to the steppe, and the Great Wall was extended and fortified in reaction. And yet, the bureaucracy the Yuan had reshaped remained. The postal systems, census rolls, and even court fashion were infused with Mongol aesthetics and pragmatism. The Ming emperors may have rejected the foreign rule of the Mongols, but they could not undo the institutional changes the Yuan had introduced. China's future as a centralized imperial state ruling over vast non-Han territories owed much to the Mongol precedent. Further west, the Safavid and Ottoman empires adopted many administrative structures pioneered by the Mongols. From tax collection to military hierarchy, from court etiquette to civil record keeping, the scaffolding of imperial order was built on Mongol blueprints. And all the while, the name Genghis Khan, and the mythos surrounding him continued to grow. In Mongolia, he was venerated not just as a conqueror, but as the founder of the Mongol identity. His memory became a sacred part of national consciousness, revered in rituals, epic poetry, and oral tradition. Even during centuries of Chinese or Soviet domination, the spirit of Genghis Khan never left the steppe. When Mongolia gained independence in the 20th century, his image returned to coins, statues, and textbooks. In the Islamic world, the Mongol legacy was more ambivalent. The early conquests had devastated Baghdad and brought down the Abbasid Caliphate, but later, Khanates like the Ilkhanate had embraced Islam and supported religious scholars and artists. The memory of Mongol rule became woven into local dynastic legitimacy, if not always celebrated, then at least acknowledged as a foundational rupture. In Europe, the Mongols were first feared, then studied. Enlightenment thinkers debated their nature. Were they brutal savages or misunderstood unifiers? Historians began to sift through Persian, Chinese, and Arabic sources, discovering not just the tales of massacre, but also of law, tolerance, and innovation. By the dawn of the modern age, the Mongol Empire was no longer simply a cautionary tale. It was a subject of fascination. Military leaders studied their tactics. Economists examined their trade networks. Political scientists looked at how such a decentralized yet effective empire had functioned. And in all of this, the truth emerged that the Mongols, for all their brutality, had not just conquered the world, they had connected it. They were not simply destroyers, they were builders of bridges between continents, cultures, and eras. Their empire had forced the world into contact with itself. And from that contact came innovation, devastation, rebirth, and transformation. Now, centuries later, the bones of the great Khan rest somewhere in the sacred ground of Khenti. His burial site remains hidden, untouched by archaeologists, veiled by legend. But his legacy is not buried. It lives in the way empires are imagined, in the systems of government still used today, and in the silent highways of trade and memory that stretch still from the forests of Siberia to the deserts of Persia. Genghis Khan had once asked the world, "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me." And perhaps that's true. But perhaps, too, he was more than punishment. Perhaps he was also the herald of a new world. The wind over the steppe still whispered in Mongol. Though the empire had fractured and its flags no longer flew over the great cities of the east and west, the name of Genghis Khan lingered in the dust, etched into the bones of Eurasia. The Khanates that had once carved up the known world, the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Ilkhanate, and the Yuan, had faded one by one, and yet their shadows remained, not just in memory, but in the foundations of the world they had helped shape. By the mid-16th century, the last true descendants of the great Khans found themselves increasingly hemmed in by rising powers. The age of horseback conquest had passed, and the gunpowder empires, the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals, ruled with muskets and cannon, bureaucracy and courts, standing armies and palaces. The Mongols, once masters of shock and speed, found their thunder outpaced by steel and powder. The Golden Horde, once the terror of Eastern Europe and the overlord of the Rus, had splintered into smaller khanates by the 15th century: Kazan, Astrakhan, Sibir, and the Crimean Khanate. These successor states maintained the memory of Mongol power, but their influence had waned. The rising Russian principalities, now consolidated under the Tsardom of Muscovy, began to push outward, challenging Mongol authority at every turn. Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, was the first to wear the title of Tsar, a word rooted in Caesar, but also echoing the autocracy of the Khans. In 1552, he stormed Kazan, ending the Tatar Khanate. 2 years later, Astrakhan fell. In 1582, with the help of Cossack raiders, Russia struck into Sibir, toppling the last major Khanate east of the Urals. The conquest of Siberia had begun, a Mongol realm now folded into the hands of their former tributaries. It was a cruel irony. The Russians had learned the art of rule from their Mongol overlords: centralization, census-taking, tax farming, and terror. They now turned these tools west and east, creating an empire that would stretch from the Baltic to the Pacific. In time, it would be the Russians, not the Mongols, who became the new lords of the steppe. Farther south, the Chagatai Khanate had long ceased to exist in its original form. Timur had shattered it during his rise, and in its place, new powers had risen, particularly the Uzbeks, who now ruled Transoxiana under the Shabanid dynasty. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara still bore the glories of the Timurid era, but the days of Mongol dominance were long gone. Even so, nomadic tribes still roamed the steppes, clinging to memories of Khans and conquests. The Kazakhs, a confederation of Turkic and Mongol peoples, emerged in the 15th century and carried on many of the customs and rhythms of the past. They would resist both Russian expansion and Chinese encroachment for centuries, a people suspended between empire and freedom. To the southwest, the Ilkhanate, once rulers of Persia, had splintered earlier than most. After the death of Abu Sa'id in 1335, the Ilkhanate disintegrated into smaller dynasties, and by the early 15th century, Timur's rise had swept away their remnants. The Safavid dynasty, emerging from a mystical Sufi order, seized control of Iran in the early 1500s. Though Persianized and Shia in doctrine, the Safavids inherited many of the Mongol administrative and military systems, as well as a taste for imperial ambition. The Yuan dynasty in China had collapsed in 1368, driven out by the Ming dynasty, who reclaimed Han Chinese sovereignty. The Mongols retreated to the steppes of the north, back to their homeland, but they were not done. In the centuries that followed, the Mongol identity in Inner Asia remained potent, if scattered. The northern Yuan continued to claim descent from Kublai Khan, and at times attempted to reconquer China. The Oirat and Dzungar Mongols formed powerful khanates that warred with both the Qing dynasty and rival tribes. These last Mongol polities were fierce and proud. The Dzungar Khanate, in particular, posed such a threat to the Qing that it was utterly destroyed in a genocidal campaign in the mid-18th century. But for every Khanate that fell, the Mongol legend only grew. It was not just in the lands they had once ruled that Genghis Khan's name endured. Across the Islamic world, his image was complicated. He had brought down the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258, a trauma still remembered with bitterness. And yet his descendants, the Ilkhanids, Chagatides, and Mughals, had all converted to Islam, becoming defenders of the faith. In India, the Mughal Empire thrived. Founded in 1526 by Babur, a descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan, the Mughals embodied a new kind of imperial grandeur. They ruled over a diverse subcontinent, fusing Persian, Turkic, and Indian traditions into a glittering civilizational mosaic. Under emperors like Akbar, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb, they commanded one of the wealthiest empires on earth. Though the Mughals did not use the title Khan, their genealogies proudly claimed descent from Genghis, and their military culture retained the ethos of the steppe. Mughal cavalry tactics, mobile artillery, and their preference for open battlefields all bore the mark of their Mongol heritage. The Taj Mahal, that great monument to love, was built not just by an Indian emperor, but by a descendant of the storm that once swept out of Mongolia. Meanwhile, In Europe, the Mongol memory was both feared and respected. Historians wrote of their destructiveness, but also of their strange tolerance, their law, their trade routes. In maps and chronicles, they were depicted not just as barbarians, but as rulers. Terrible, yes, but undeniably skilled. The Tatar yoke haunted Slavic memory for centuries, but the awe remained. Even Jesuit missionaries in China and Persia wrote home with tales of Mongol ruins and descendants, of peoples who still trace their lineage to the great Khan. They saw firsthand the crumbling cities along the Silk Road, where once a Mongol courier could travel from the Black Sea to Beijing in under 100 days. But the greatest testament to the Mongol legacy lay not in any single state or dynasty, but in the connectedness they had brought to the world. Before the Mongols, Eurasia had been a patchwork, fragmented, distrustful, insulated. China did not know Europe. Persia did not know the full shape of Russia. Trade was dangerous, diplomacy rare. The Mongol conquests, as brutal as they were, forcibly stitched the world together. In their wake came globalization's first draft. Merchants traveled further. Embassies were exchanged across continents. Technologies, gunpowder, papermaking, navigation, leapt across cultural borders. In a strange and often tragic way, the Mongol Empire was the first truly planetary system, making the world both smaller and bigger all at once. And what of the Mongols themselves? By the 19th century, most Mongol polities had been absorbed. Russia controlled Siberia and Central Asia. The Qing ruled Mongolia. The Mughals, weakened by internal division and European encroachment, had become puppets in Delhi. The Ottomans stood alone in the Muslim world, their empire cracking under its own weight. But in the hills of Khenti, in the open lands of Orkhon and Karakorum, Mongol herders still sang the old songs. They told their children stories of the boy Temujin, who had nothing, no tribe, no inheritance, no future, and who rose to shake the world. They recited his laws, honored his shrines, and remembered his victories. And when Mongolia declared independence in the 20th century, they did so under his name. Genghis Khan was no longer just a conqueror. He had become a symbol of unity, of identity, of survival. In modern Ulaanbaatar, his statue towers above the plains. His face is on currency. His name is spoken with reverence. Mongolian children still study his life in school. His memory is no longer one of fear, but of pride. For the Mongols, he is the father of the nation. For the world, he remains a force of history, one who shattered boundaries, burned empires, connected civilizations, and forever altered the course of humanity. The steppe lay silent, the grass rustling under a wind that had once carried the hooves of 10,000 horses. The dust that rose from the earth in spirals was no longer churned by war caravans, nor darkened by the shadows of eagles trained for the hunt. And yet, if one listened closely enough, not with the ears, but with the heart, the thunder of the Mongol Empire could still be heard, faint but eternal, echoing through the ages. This was the legacy of Genghis Khan, not just an empire that had once stretched across the horizon of the known world, but a myth that refused to die. His body had long since vanished into the secret folds of the Khenti Mountains, where no map pointed and no marker stood. But the spirit of the Khan, like a restless wind, was never laid to rest. The 13th century had given rise to a force of nature, a man named Temujin, born into obscurity, abandoned in youth, scorned by chieftains, hunted by rivals, and shaped by a landscape as unforgiving as it was infinite. But where others were crushed by hardship, Temujin was tempered like iron. His story was not just one of war, but of reinvention, of unity, law, vision, and ruthless pragmatism. He built something from nothing, creating the largest contiguous land empire in human history. No one, not Alexander, not Caesar, not Napoleon, ever ruled so much of the Earth's surface. But what became of it? By the 17th century, the Mongol world had faded. The great Khanates had either collapsed under their own weight, been conquered by outside forces, or absorbed into new empires with new identities. The Golden Horde was a memory. The Chagatai Khanate dissolved, the Ilkhanate long forgotten, and the Yuan dynasty reduced to exile on the steppes. And yet, in their place had risen new empires built upon Mongol bones. The Russian Tsardom, the Ottoman Sultanate, the Safavid dynasty, and the Mughal Empire all bore Mongol fingerprints, whether in their statecraft, military strategy, architecture, or sense of imperial destiny. The Silk Road had been revived and then rerouted. Global trade expanded, and knowledge had been shared across cultures that had once been utterly disconnected. In some ways, Genghis Khan had forged the blueprint for modern global civilization. But legacy is a curious thing. Outside Mongolia, Genghis Khan became many things. In Europe, he was at first a nightmare, a barbaric scourge that descended like locusts, burning cities and toppling kings. Over time, he was reassessed as a brilliant general, a leader whose cruelty was offset by an uncanny ability to organize, command, and inspire. In Persia and the Islamic world, he was the destroyer of Baghdad, the one who brought down the House of Wisdom, whose armies desecrated mosques and flattened caliphates. And yet, his descendants became Muslim rulers, defenders of Islam, builders of mosques and madrasas. In China, he was the foreign invader who conquered the Middle Kingdom, but whose Yuan dynasty rebuilt infrastructure, promoted trade, and expanded the empire to unprecedented size. Even as the Ming expelled the Mongols, they preserved many Yuan policies, acknowledging their efficiency even if they could never admit admiration. In India, the Mughals proudly traced their ancestry to him, and in their lavish courts, his name was whispered not with fear, but reverence. Babur's memoirs spoke of the great ancestor as both warrior and wise man, and his name was invoked in the palaces of Akbar and Shah Jahan as a symbol of strength and divine favor. But it was in Mongolia itself that the fire never died. For centuries after the empire's fall, Mongols lived under the yoke of foreign empires. First, the Manchu Qing, then the Soviet Union, and always under suspicion for their proud heritage. In the communist 20th century, Genghis Khan's name was suppressed, his monuments torn down or never erected. The new regimes feared his memory, the way it united people, the way it evoked a time when Mongols ruled the world. But memory, like steppe grass after a fire, always returns. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Mongolia regained its independence in 1990, and almost immediately, Genghis Khan's name roared back to life. His face appeared on the new currency, statues rose across Ulaanbaatar, streets were renamed, universities and airports bore his name. Mongolian children once again learned the stories of Temujin, of how he had risen from a poor boy hunting marmots with a homemade bow to become the scourge and unifier of continents. He was no longer just a conqueror. He was the father of the nation, the ultimate Mongol, the source of both pride and purpose. In a world increasingly global and yet rootless, Mongolians looked to him not just as history, but as identity. And beyond Mongolia, fascination with Genghis Khan only grew. In books and documentaries, video games and films, he was reborn again and again. Sometimes as a warlord, sometimes as a genius strategist, sometimes as a misunderstood hero. He became a paradox, The man who killed millions, yet promoted religious freedom, who raised cities, yet built civilizations, who spoke no foreign tongue, yet ruled more foreigners than any man in history. Scientists even sought him in the DNA of humanity. A 2003 study concluded that 1 in 200 men alive today carry a genetic marker traced back to Genghis Khan, evidence of both his prolific lineage and the spread of his empire. His legacy was not just in history books, but written in the blood of the living. But what truly was that legacy? Was it destruction or unity? Was it fear or order? Perhaps it was all of it. The Mongol Empire was a contradiction, savage yet sophisticated, brutal yet lawful, destructive yet creative. It forced the medieval world to confront its borders, to reckon with difference, to adapt or perish. And Genghis Khan, for all his flaws, for all the rivers of blood spilled in his name, had accomplished what no other mortal had, to take a fractured world and make it kneel, not for a day, not for a battle, but for a generation. As the final echoes of the Mongol saga fade into history's endless plain, one is left with the image of an old man on horseback, staring at the horizon. Not at a palace, not at a throne, but at the steppe, endless and wild, just as it was when he began. And in that silence, he whispers the creed of his life. If you are afraid, don't do it. If you're doing it, don't be afraid. Genghis Khan died in 1227, but he was never truly buried. He rides still in myth, in memory, and in every story where the impossible becomes real and one soul reshapes the fate of millions.